Please, I apologize already now for any technical difficulties. It's Zoom, so let's just call them, and I hope you will enjoy.
Thank you very much for having me. If there are any technical issues throughout, you can message me in the chat box or just try and get my attention. This is my first time doing a hybrid event like this where I'm joining online, but everyone is in person. So feel free to flag any technical issues if you have them. So my name is Robbie Stakelum. The pronouns I use are he, him, and I work for FEANTSA, which is a European umbrella group of homeless service providers. We effectively represent about 140 homeless services from across Europe. And my presentation should be up now, Matea. Can you see it, everybody?
Yes, that's perfect.
Wonderful. So what I'm going to do today is I'd like to talk a little bit about what is LGBTIQ homelessness in Europe like. So I'm going to start by talking about some of the challenges that we face as a sector when working on this particular topic and issue. And then I want to talk a bit more about what is the scale of the problem in Europe today. How many young people who identify as LGBTIQ are experiencing or at risk of homelessness. And then to wrap up, I'm going to do a spotlight on 3 different types of services that are working with LGBTIQ young people to act as some sort of inspiration to say how different services have approached this topic in the past. And I hope that my presentation isn't too repetitive because I know True Colours and Sylvia from Tow Housing will be presenting later. So hopefully it will all be really interesting and there won't be too much overlap. So to talk about the first key challenge we face as a sector when talking about this issue, I'm not sure how well this phrase translates from English into Slovenian, but there is that phrase, hear no evil, see no evil, speak no evil. And I typically think this is what has happened to LGBTIQ homelessness in the last maybe 5 to 10 years in Europe. It's this attitude of we don't hear about it, we don't talk about it, it simply doesn't exist. And of course, that isn't the case at all. I think if you look at what's the data that I will get to in a moment, it's clear that it is a problem today, but it's almost like as a sector, we have put our head in the sand when talking about this issue over the last number of years. Effectively, we've denied the existence of this problem. Simply because it is a hidden form of homelessness. For the most part, you're not going to see LGBTIQ people experiencing homelessness the same way that you would see women experiencing homelessness or young people. You know, an LGBTIQ person is not going to be wrapped in a rainbow flag sleeping on the street or in your service. And so if you don't have the right mechanisms in place to collect data in an inclusive, respectful and sensitive way, then this issue simply cannot come to the ground because we don't know exactly the scale of the problem that we are dealing with. In my own experience, from FEANTSA's perspective and how we have come to work more and more on this topic, it has simply gradually crept into the wider discussions on youth homelessness. And so about 4 or 5 years ago, we noticed that some of our members were coming to us and saying, oh, you know, we're seeing a few gay people in our services, we're seeing a few trans people in our services, but it was never a call to action, or it was never an organization saying, this is a big problem, we need to do something about it. It was always these kind of very small side conversations I was having with people while talking about the issue of youth homelessness. At the same time, we started to do a little bit of work on this in our office. We looked into research, predominantly coming from North America in the United States. True Colours United, who are going to speak later, have honestly a wealth of expertise and resources on this issue. And we also looked to what was happening in Canada and in countries like England, Wales, and France, where there was some limited research available. And consistently what we found was that 20 to 40% of young people who experience homelessness identified as LGBTIQ. And for me, there was just this enormous disconnect between what independent research kept telling us, what we were seeing in other contexts, but it was never coming to the fore from our membership. And I simply think it's because it just wasn't a spoken issue. Institutional erasure, it's a terminology that has been coined by Dr. Alex Abramovich and Dr. James Shelton. And essentially what happens with institutional erasure is you through the mechanisms that you collect data, you are erasing people's experiences and effectively their identities. As a homeless sector, we have a unfortunate tradition in throwing bureaucracy and administrative systems at a problem. And that's not something homeless services always wanted to do. Often the mechanisms and the way that we are funded as a sector by local authorities, by funders, by national ministries responsible for housing, homelessness and poverty, they demand to know exactly what we are doing. So there's a hell of a lot of admin work that goes into running homeless services. The problem is those administrative structures are very outdated and they're very, very old. So if you go in and you're working in a homeless service provider, typically the intake forms are quite binary. So if they even ask you for gender identity, it's male or female, and that's it. There's no other boxes, there's no open spaces to put other information into it. You simply have to almost fit into the structure that the homeless service provider has. And in general, we don't even ask for questions around sexual orientation. And so what happens then is if you go to homeless service providers and say, are you working with any LGBTIQ people who are experiencing homelessness? They'll turn around and say, no, that's not an issue for us. And it's simply not an issue because through this institutional erasure and how they have designed their data collection systems, it's just not coming up. They can't see it in the same way that if they ask for information around age, that they could see, okay, youth homelessness is an issue. Or if they're asking questions around mental health difficulties and challenges, they can see, okay, we're dealing with some people who have mental health problems that we need to put services in place. This tradition, I would say, happens quite unintentionally. I've been working on this topic now for the last 4 or 5 years. And in general, in most European countries that we work with their members in, they are incredibly open to working on LGBTIQ homelessness, and will say the homophobic or transphobic attitudes aren't there. From my side, what I've noticed is I think the reason why this issue hasn't come to the surface, and this is such a challenge, is because homeless services, they just lack training on this topic. You know, when we first did a workshop on this in Berlin a number of years ago, a lot of our members said, oh, I can't ask somebody if they're gay. I can't talk to somebody about their gender identity. That's totally inappropriate. It's none of my business. It's not for me to discuss with them. But at the same time, they could have very complex, difficult and challenging conversations with the same people around poly drug use, around sex work, around psychosis and different forms of mental illness, substance use problems. And the difference between those two areas is they were given the training and the resources to be able to have those types of conversations and to be able to have those conversations about something like mental health or drug use, and then to be able to do something with that information so that the service can respond to those needs. And when we look at LGBTIQ homelessness, there's a disconnect there because they've never been given that type of training to hold those types of conversations. You know, when we get into having conversations around, I think a lot of topics that people in the hall today would take for granted, like something like pronouns, when they've never heard about these, when they've never discussed them, there is just a total lack of understanding about why something is important and why more needs to be done about it and how to create an inclusive service. And it's not that they don't want to do it. It's more so that they've just never thought about it and no one has ever come to them and say, this is something that you should look at doing. And often we've heard as well that members are often afraid of saying the wrong thing, of offending people, of having conversations about sexual orientation or gender identity that they think would be a little bit more, I don't know what the word I'm trying to think of is, but that they would be a bit more off-put if someone spoke to them about their sexual orientation in a homeless service. And of course, this whole issue of institutional erasure is underscored by the fact that for a lot of young people experiencing homelessness who identify as LGBTIQ, there is a lot of trauma that comes with their coming out. And so for a lot of people, it's not just that they're homeless and that they are trans or intersex or they're gay or they're lesbian or bisexual. it's the two are very much connected, that they have played a role with one another. And so if you're a young person and you're kicked out of your home because you're trans or because you're gay and your family have either actively evicted you and kicked you out because they don't agree or whatever terminology they want to use is, or if they just create a very oppressive and discriminatory atmosphere in the family home that the young person decides to leave because it is in their best interests, the fact that their sexual orientation or gender identity has played a role in them becoming homeless obviously has a traumatic effect. And when you go into a homeless service provider, you're not going to automatically open up about that. It's not going to be the first thing you want to talk about because you have a very negative experience of it. And I don't want to get too into the details of some of the research that we've done, because I think True Colours will be touching on it in their presentation. But what we found when we surveyed our members is in how they designed their data collection systems, they rarely ever ask questions about gender identity that are fully inclusive, and they rarely ever ask questions about sexual orientation. And the upshot of that is when we ask them, how do you know if you're working with LGBTIQ young people? What they said is they either have a hunch that the service providers themselves are making assumptions about young people coming into the service, or they wait for the young people to talk to them. And in that situation, you're putting an enormous burden on young people to be open and to share their sexual orientation or their gender identity with the service provider, when the service provider hasn't really made any moves to create a welcoming space or a safe space or a space where they feel included. The other kind of topic I want to bring in as well is when we talk about things like sexual orientation, gender identity, and gender expression, is who's fundamentally responsible for having those types of conversations with young people who are experiencing homelessness. And it's a very, on the one hand, it's a very simple and straightforward question, like who cares? Obviously, we all care. Homeless service providers fundamentally care because they want to give a good, effective, inclusive service that helps people to exit homelessness. And obviously LGBTIQ organizations want to have those conversations for the exact same reasons. They fundamentally want to have a positive impact in their community. But what I've noticed has happened over the last number of years, I think that's why we're kind of getting to a point where LGBTIQ homelessness is very much on the agenda, is we have these two silos of homeless services on one side, who are typically underfunded, they're over-demanded, they are constantly under pressure, they're constantly getting cuts, they're seeing an increasing demand for their services and have less and less resources to do with that. And the question that homeless services would ask is, well, is it fair that you're giving us another responsibility and another topic to work on when we're already under such crisis at the moment? And at the same time, you can have LGBTIQ organizations who typically their mandates are more around civil liberties, discrimination, equality, hate speech, etc. They're not necessarily experts in socioeconomic inequalities. Their experience on topics like housing and homelessness is quite limited. And so those organizations can quite easily turn around and say, well, homelessness isn't our issue to work on, it's not our responsibility. And so it's within this gap that has been created, this vacuum, which is where a lot of, unfortunately, LGBTIQ young people fall into, where both homeless services or both services care about these young people, but it's not very clear-cut who is actually responsible for developing these services and interventions. And so if I would say, is it fair for homeless services to have this added responsibility? What I've said to organizations that have asked me this question is, you already have this responsibility. Perhaps you don't know it because of institutional erasure, but when I get onto the data in a moment, you'll see there are LGBTIQ young people coming through your services, you just don't know it. And so this isn't about having more responsibility and having to do more services. What this is about is reframing the existing services you have so that they are effective and they can really, really support the young people who are coming through the door. And similarly, what we've seen from the research with LGBTIQ serving organizations is that, is homelessness one of their responsibilities? No, but if you look at their mandates around creating safe spaces and protecting the community and training other social services, I think there clearly is a mandate there to do more together. Before I get on to the data, I was asked to talk a little bit about what is homelessness. And within FEANTSA, we have developed a concept called ethos. I've tried to put a screenshot of it onto my slide. There's a lot of information. Of course, I'll share my slides afterwards with Mattea, but if you just Google FEANTSA and ethos, you'll find this document and you'll find a whole load of resources on our website. Ethos is effectively the European typology of homelessness and housing exclusion. We developed it, I would say maybe 10, 15 years ago at this point, because there wasn't a common definition about what homelessness was in Europe. And so in FEANTSA, how we look at homelessness and housing exclusion is we try to look at it across 3 different domains: the physical, the leisure, and the legal. So I'm going to talk you through a little bit about how that actually looks in practice in terms of looking at what homelessness is. One of the biggest issues that we have as a sector at the moment is there is a stereotype that homelessness is, I don't know, a man in his 30s or 40s with an alcohol or drug addiction problem. And that tends to be the image that's perpetuated in the media. And when you talk about homelessness, that generally is the first thing that comes to people's minds. And what we try to do with Ethos is to expand people's understanding of what homelessness actually is. It's not just people sleeping rough on the street, and it's not just people who are in homeless services. It's a lot broader. And so on our website, if you go and look for this ethos definition, you'll see a very detailed breakdown of it. But for, we'll say, the purposes of today, to do a little crash course on ethos, the first element is the physical. So we're talking about the physical domains of the house. If you don't have the 4 walls and a roof, 4 walls around you and a roof over your head, you're homeless. And that typically comes up in people who are sleeping rough. That is probably the most common and the most often associated form of homelessness that people have in their heads. The second that we don't think of as much, though, is the leisure. So if you, and that means to have to be able to use a space that you're in for your own leisure, for your own enjoyment, to do with it what you want to do. If you see somebody who's staying in emergency accommodation or in hostels, yes, they have the physical, they have the 4 walls around them and a roof over their head, but often emergency accommodation comes with a lot of conditions for accessing. And so you can't access it until perhaps 8 p.m. that evening. You don't know if you're going to get it, maybe until 3 or 4 p.m. that evening if you have to call an emergency line. You might be kicked out at 8 o'clock in the morning. You might not be allowed to access it with your family or with your children. You might not be allowed to socialize with people within that service. And so even though you might have the physical side of it, you don't have any function of the leisure and to be able to enjoy the space for what you want to use it for. And the third element is the legal side of ethos. And the legal dimension is about, do you have a right to reside in where you are staying? This is the element that I think most impacts on LGBTIQ young people experiencing homelessness, because we know from research that's out there, and maybe Gregory and Coco might touch on this later, but we know that LGBTIQ young people who come through homeless services have such a negative experience because the services typically aren't designed to meet their needs, that they don't choose to sleep rough because it can be they can experience discrimination, homophobia, transphobia, and sometimes violence. Similarly, within the hostel and emergency accommodation services, they rarely ever feel like inclusive spaces. So they don't feel like it's a space that they're empowered in to talk about their experiences, their identity, to fundamentally talk about their needs for which a homeless service can then manage and meet those needs. They can experience homophobia and transphobia, both from other fellow clients, but also from, in some instances, homeless services. And within the LGBTIQ community, there is that community. It's a very strong sense of bonding amongst the group. And typically what LGBTIQ young people do, and young people more generally, is they will rely on their support network. They will rely on the network that's around them for sofa surfing. So rather than engaging with social services, they'll stay with a friend for a week, and then another friend for a week, and then maybe a cousin for a week, and they'll continuously rotate. And one of the things I find quite interesting about this form of rotation is you often have a lot of people who are sofa surfing, but they never identify with being homeless. And so we've seen this a lot with our members, that when they work with young people who are sofa surfing, sometimes for 6 months to 18 months, and they ask them, oh, you know, why didn't you come to us sooner? And they say, well, I'm not really homeless. And again, this comes back to this idea that homelessness is somehow only people who are sleeping rough in the street. And so I think a huge element that we need to work on is combating our understanding of what homelessness is and broadening people's awareness of it. And so one of the issues we have with sofa surfing is you really don't have a legal right to reside where you are. You are depending on the kindness, sometimes of strangers, but also the kindness of your community. And you're in a very vulnerable position if you're sofa surfing. If you look at COVID, for example, COVID has prevented a hell of a lot of people from being able to sofa surf because they can't move from household to household because of the rules of social mixing or the rules of restrictions, etc. So, you know, they don't have legal tenure there, for example. It also opens you up to exploitation as well, labor exploitation, sex work exploitation, because you don't have the legal right and tenure to stay where you are. And we also include squatting in this group as well. You might, if you're squatting, you might have the physical walls around you and the roof. You might have the leisure, the space to enjoy yourself, but you could be evicted. You could be moved along very quickly. And if you're in that position, it's a very quick, unfortunate pathway into experiencing homelessness. That is effectively how FEANTSA would look at defining homelessness. And when we talk about LGBTIQ homelessness, we are predominantly, not exclusively, but predominantly talking about sofa surfing. That tends to be the primary experience of homelessness that LGBTIQ people have. And as a homeless service provider, one of the challenges we face there is if people are sofa surfing and they're not engaging with social services, it makes it more difficult to know where these people are, to know what their needs are, and to meet their needs. And it's kind of like we've developed this really vicious cycle where LGBTIQ people have probably come to homeless services in the past, haven't felt they were safe, haven't felt that they were inclusive, and then withdrew from those services. They might have experienced violence, they might have experienced harassment or homophobia or transphobia. Because of that negative experience, they're less likely to go back to the service. But because when they were in that service, we had institutional erasure, so nobody was collecting data on them, the service providers would turn around and say, well, these people don't exist. And now if we say, okay, we need to work on this topic, the challenge we face is that because of the negative experiences they've had in the past, they are less likely to engage with homeless and social services. And because of institutional erasure, they are much less likely to, services are much less likely to even be aware as to what the scale of LGBTIQ homelessness is. And it is within that vicious cycle that we have tried to work on this topic. And so with ILGA-Europe and with True Colours United, we spent a lot of time in the last 2 to 3 years building an awareness with LGBTIQ organisations and with homeless services about what you should be doing differently. In terms of how do you quantify this as a problem? How can we even understand what scale LGBTIQ homelessness is in Europe? Up until last year, it was near to impossible. For all the reasons I've already cited, it's just a very challenging area to work in. However, there are 2 European agencies that have been collecting data on homelessness in the last 2 years. So EU-SILC is a survey that is operated by the European Commission through Eurostat, and it basically looks at the standards of income and living conditions in Europe. It's a household survey, so obviously it's not great for assessing homelessness because they're only asking people who are already housed. But what they did was they asked people, do they have retrospective experiences of homelessness? So to see, okay, in the past, did you experience homelessness and what was that like? And they used the ethos definition to define sofa surfing, staying in emergency accommodation, sleeping rough, or staying in a place that isn't intended to be a permanent home. At the same time, the Fundamental Rights Agency did a survey of the quality of life of the LGBTIQ community in Europe. And into that survey, we asked them to ask the exact same questions, word for word, with the exact same answers, to try and be able to get some sort of harmonized data, to be able to say, okay, what are the experiences of the general population and what are the experiences of the LGBTIQ population. So I'm not sure how clear this slide is going to be for all of you. But effectively what we have here is the first blue column in each section is the general population. And that's EU data in general coming from EU Silk. And so 3% of the general population have had to sofa surf in the past. That rises to 14% for the LGBTIQ community. But what's very important is that rises even further for trans community and the intersex community. They represent the last two columns. And you see that throughout. So no matter what form of homelessness we're talking about here, whether it is sofa surfing, staying in emergency accommodation, staying in a place not intended as permanent housing, or sleeping rough, not only do the LGBTIQ community experience homelessness more often across all categories, but it rises for both the trans community and the intersex community. That's probably something I think Gregory and Coco will touch on, is looking at how do we meet the specific needs of LGBTIQ people, because it's not just about sexual orientation. The T is incredibly important, and the I, when we're talking about how do we deliver services that are fully inclusive. What's interesting about this data is it tallies really closely to data from the US, from Canada, from France, from England and Wales. And so when we first started to see this data, some people said, oh, well, I mean, this couldn't possibly be true. And it's such an over-representation of the LGBTIQ community experiencing homelessness. There must be something wrong with this data. But when you can point to it and say, well, actually, this tallies really closely to other independent research by think tanks and foundations, it is quite clear. Matea, were you going
Robbie?
to comment? Yeah.
Yes, sorry for stopping. There is not really an elegant way to do this, but I just wanted to say, in order to also leave some time for the people from the audience to ask some questions, I would actually ask you to maybe share just the last thought of your input, and then we give the word also to the people here. Is that okay?
Perfect. Yeah, no problem. So just to wrap up, and I'll share these slides anyway, I have some data specifically on Slovenia. Unfortunately, there wasn't enough responses from the intersex community, so we don't have data. But again, you can see the LGBTIQ community in general and the trans community have higher experiences of homelessness than the general population when you're looking at the Slovenian context. And maybe just a very, very quick word, I'll be short, Matea. These are 3 different organizations I wanted to share on how they work on homelessness. You can look them up on LGBTIQ homelessness. You can Google them and look them up online. But Focus Ireland is a general homeless service provider, and they've done a lot of work on doing research and understanding how, as a broad stream, mainstream service, they can work with the LGBTIQ community. The Rock Trust is an organization that works specifically on youth homelessness, and they've done a lot of work to be able to deliver services specifically for LGBTIQ young people coming into their services. And then finally, Le Refuge is a network of homeless shelters specifically for LGBTIQ people across 20 cities in France. And the idea here is just to show you that there are different approaches from mainstream services to youth-specific services to LGBTIQ-specific services. And I know you'll be hearing from Sylvia in a moment, or later today, with an example of an LGBTIQ-specific service into housing in Italy. That's it for me. Very happy to hear any questions.
Okay.
What do you think should be next steps in Europe in general? Like, what do you recognize as effective ways to either start tackling this issue or continue it? Like, what should we focus on with our limited capacity, basically?
Thank you very much, Naya, for the question. There's a lot of next steps, to be perfectly honest. I think, excuse me, there's a few different things. I'll start with something that could be quite Slovenian specific. Is the Slovenian presidency is the, I think it's one of the next upcoming presidencies. I think you have it the second half of this year of the EU. And at the same time, the European Commission on Monday is going to launch a European platform on combating homelessness. And so this platform, the aim of it is to empower member states to build research, to get resources, to direct EU funds to support homelessness in general. It's not specifically on LGBTIQ homelessness at all, but it's quite a much broader part of it. Of course, as FEANTSA, we are lobbying that will include topics around homelessness. it could be a very good step at a Slovenian level to lobby the Slovenian presidency to do something on LGBTIQ homelessness. From my side, I'd be very happy to assist in that, because last week the Slovenian presidency announced that they will host the first official meeting of this platform during the presidency. And so it sounds like on some part of the second half of the year, that would be a very big moment for the platform, and it could be a very good moment to profile and to get LGBTIQ homelessness on the radar of this platform. More generally, we need to do more training and awareness raising with our members. I mean that from looking at homeless service providers and with LGBTIQ organizations. To be honest, I think at this point, we've kind of gone beyond the awareness raising. I think we spent a lot of time in the last 2 to 3 years educating our members about this as a topic, trying to get their buy-in to understand why it's important. And now what we need to do is to start doing trainings. FEANTSA and Sqvot last year ran a training for about 4 to 5 months online. Matea, you were one of our guest lecturers, and that worked quite well in getting our members, a select few of our members who were working on this topic already, to kind of get more formal training of like, how do you talk about sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression in a homeless service provider? How do you design services that are a bit more inclusive? So I think that kind of training element is probably really, really important. And I think what we're also trying to do more and more in the next year or two is to encourage our members to look at using EU funds to combat LGBTIQ homelessness. EU funds are notoriously difficult to access for administrative systems and things like that. And I know they're difficult, but we're trying to provide some resources to get people to do it, because there is quite a lot of money. I think there's something like 88 billion in the ESF between 2020 and 2027. So it's a lot of funding, if we can access it, to mobilize around homelessness.
Perfect, thank you, Robbie. Maybe we will just check if there's one more question from the audience. So basically the question was about any particularities, right, within the LGBT community, of a trans community specifically?
I think one of the, and again, maybe Gregory and Coco might touch on this, but Dr. Jamie Shelton has done a lot of research on this. And I think one of the, really sad outcomes from their research has been that trans people have longer experiences of homelessness than the rest of the LGBTIQ community, and their outcomes are much, much worse. And I think that's just because the way we have designed homeless services, most homeless services out there they were designed 50, 60 years ago. Some of them are over 100 years old. They were designed for men in their 40s or 50s. They're not really fit for the LGBTIQ community or for young people or for women today. And so I think if you are a trans woman going into a homeless service provider, they're on the whole just not designed to meet your needs. And I think that's something that's part of the training that we need to educate social service providers to be able to respond to that in a much, much better way. I think Sylvia as well will be able to speak to this topic in particular. They do a fantastic program on trans inclusion within their services and work with different health practitioners. And so we've had Sylvia speak in the past about how to meet those needs. And I think she'll be in a much better expert position to guide.
Perfect. Thank you for this trailer for the upcoming program, and thank you once again so much for joining us online. I really this match is hybrid moment, but I hope it was that nice. So, Robbie, thanks once again. We will now continue. So, yeah. So we continue. I would actually like to invite the lovely people in the back, Gregory Lewis and Coco Wheeler, who are joining us here from Two Colors United from the United States, who will also share their practice with us. We are very, very excited, especially because they did and are still doing the groundbreaking work in the area of LGBTIQ+ youth homelessness. So thank you. The floor is yours.
So we're thrilled to be here and really honored to be a part of this important day and this important week. And thrilled to see all of you. I'm Gregory Lewis. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of True Colors United. My pronouns are he and him.
I'm Coco Wheeler, she, her, they, them pronouns. I'm Associate Program Director, and in our training and education department?
So in America, 4.2 million young people experience some form of homelessness each year, all various forms that Robbie talked about in their presentation. 1 in 30 youth ages 13 to 17, and 1 in 10 young adults from 18 to 25 who've experienced some form of homelessness. And that was an important piece of data because a lot of times when you think about youth homelessness, you're thinking about young people 18 and younger. We're actually the majority in America, and what we're seeing elsewhere as well is that it's actually 18 to 25-year-olds. And a lot of services tend to be built for 18 and younger and not for the 18 to 25, particularly for LGBTQ youth, that's even more. So next slide. So in America, LGBTQ youth are 120% more likely to experience homelessness than non-LGBTQ youth, and up to 40% of our youth homelessness population is LGBTQ, compared to 7 to 10% of our general youth population being LGBTIQ. And then, particularly in America, and we need a lot more data on this around the globe, LGBT youth of color are disproportionately impacted in experiencing homelessness. 1 in 4 LGBTQ Black men, young men in America, will experience some form of homelessness in their life. And then the disproportionality of impact of homelessness on LGBTQ youth is much higher than non-LGBTQ youth. Everything from facing discrimination from their own family, from society, forced to have sex, physically harmed by others, harmed by themselves. Across the board, the numbers are just exponentially higher. And again, data, there's really not much data from around the globe. The numbers that we do have are continuing to confirm that everywhere. Next slide. So True Colors United is about implementing long-term solutions to ending youth homelessness by focusing in on LGBTQ youth and youth of color and other highly impacted populations of young people. And that can be different based on where you're looking at around the globe. And we do that through 4 key areas: training and education, advocacy, youth collaboration, and technical assistance. Next slide. The most cited reasons, and again, also kind of showing up in some of our global research: family rejection, either running away or forced out of the home, abuse, physical, emotional, sexual abuse, aging out of the child welfare system, which LGBTQ youth are already overrepresented in, and then financial and emotional neglect from family. And so one thing that's not up there is that we also have to look at poverty and racism. They both play significant roles in a lot of those situations. And then in America, this was an important piece of data for us, and it's an important piece of data around the globe, which is that 99% of service providers in America report working with LGBTQ youth. And why that's important is because we dealt with this kind of misinformation of that LGBTQ youth were only getting support from LGBTQ providers, when the majority of them are getting it from mainstream, non-LGBTQ specific providers, which leads to having to make sure that services are safe for every person that's walking through the door, which if you go to the next slide. That's why we center the experience of those who are the most marginalized by our societal systems and institutions to create policies and programs and interventions which create a more equitable system for all. So many systems are built for, even within a vulnerable, marginalized population, for the most privileged, as opposed to centering those who are the most impacted, which in this situation would be like a Black trans young woman. If a service can serve them, then they will be able to serve any young person that walks through the door, because they're the most impacted, they're the most vulnerable. So we really work with a theory of change of centering the most highly impacted, with meeting people where they are. We don't start from where we are. We know where we are. We're confident in like what we believe and what we're doing. It's about meeting people where they are to help them do better tomorrow than they're doing today. And then we believe in supporting individual, system, and systemic change, structural change. So we've partnered, we've had about a 3-year partnership with ILGA-Europe and FEANTSA, really amazing partnership, in which we all agree we have a number of things we're working on together, but one is data, knowledge is power. The more information we have, the more we'll be able to impact the kind of change. And why we gave kind of the American construct is that we just finished doing a series of research and reports with both of them here in Europe, that surveyed what we've done in America and how we've been able to make some of the progress that we've been able to make there, which is that by surveying hundreds of homelessness providers across the United States, we were able to elevate the issue and create a clear path forward because we were hearing from the people on the ground doing the work every single day of what was actually needed, so that we weren't just shooting in the dark, just coming up with things in our way of saying, yeah, we know it needs to happen. It's actually coming from the people doing the work and from young people. And then that opened up conversations with leaders. We can go to our federal government, we can go to state governments, we can go to local leaders and say, listen, here's the information. Can't say you don't know anymore. And so fortunately they did listen, particularly in the Obama administration and now in the Biden administration, to actually put the kind of changes in that are actually going to be in response to the need. And then we shifted the focus and were able to center LGBTQ youth in those conversations. 10 years ago, LGBTQ youth were nowhere in the conversation. Now they're at the heart of the conversations in America. And it led to various initiatives. With our federal government in particular, we have a new $450 million a year program that's investing in over 75 communities, ultimately 150 communities in America, on how to prevent homelessness. So I'm going to turn this over to Coco, but we did a series of reports, one with FEANTSA surveying their membership, then we did one with ILGA surveying their membership, and then a comparative.
Yeah. So I hope you like numbers. If you don't, hold breath. In the afternoon session, it'll be a little bit more focused on like hands-on tools for working with LGBTIQ young people. But for now, to give some context and relay some of the data that they worked so hard to collect, we're going to hit that. So these are the countries that were represented within the data in the reports. You can see there's an overwhelming representation from the Netherlands as well as Belgium. These are all FEANTSA organizations, so it makes sense there with that being reflected. Next slide. In terms of the people who were surveyed, the majority of them were mainly youth homelessness serving organizations. Some others worked with young people experiencing housing instability or homelessness, but those weren't the main focus. Next slide. And this is something that we see across the board, this very varying definition of youth. And so I think Robbie talked about this a little bit. You can see here that there's really no consensus in terms of what makes a young person a young person. We actually have this in the United States as well. And what ends up happening here, of course, is for young people up to age 18, they receive really catered supportive services, ideally. But then young people ages 18 up to 30 are usually in the mainstream adult homelessness system that is really not looking at their specific needs. And I think, in general, that highlights the very deep need for a general consensus on what a young person is, as well as what homelessness is. Having these really widespread definitions can only help to assist in supporting young people. So these are like the general ranges of ages that people highlighted for something else, and that was the majority of respondents saying that they identify youth as something else. In terms of demographic data, so that's everything from age, sex, gender identity, sexual orientation, 72% are collecting this. But a quarter of homelessness providers are not collecting any of this demographic data. Next slide. You can see overwhelmingly the data that is being collected is age and sex. But in terms of sexual orientation, gender identity, race and ethnicity, we're really not capturing that data. Which brings me to the next slide, which is, does your organization work with young people who identify as LGBTIQ? We have 64% of people saying that they do, but we had a very small amount of organizations that were saying they collected this data at all. So it kind of makes the question, well, how do you know if you're not even collecting the data? This is how they know. So we have, some people are asking on the intake form, not a ton. Some people are asking, or having young people initiate that conversation, coming to them and asking, letting them know their identity. People sometimes will ask privately, but there is 20% of homelessness providers are saying they just have a feeling, which is cool and all, but also it leads you to wonder, what is this feeling based on? It's probably based on really broad stereotypes and things that I would say don't do that. But in general, it does highlight the need to really be asking, because if you don't ask, you do not know. In general. Next. In terms of guessing how many young people they serve identify as LGBTIQ, because we do know that they're not really asking, the majority are saying anywhere from 10% to 50%. Again, those are numbers that we see reflected in the United States, whether it's a rural area, an urban area, big cities, what have you. We're seeing this consistently across the board. We do have some honesty. I have no idea. That's about 30% of people. Next. In terms of specialized services for LGBTIQ youth, only 13% are saying that they do offer these services. But again, the data tells a story, and what it's saying in the previous slide is that up to 50% of young people are being estimated at experiencing housing instability or homelessness, and yet we're only offering services at 13% of these resources. So what is that disconnect, and how is that happening? Next slide. Any specialized services for transgender youth, even less of an opportunity there. We only have about 8% of homelessness service providers that are offering specialized supports for trans young people. Next slide. Thank you. In terms of responses specific to people that are working with LGBTIQ youth, people that aren't sure if they are, and people who are saying we do not. Even the organizations that are saying we know that we work with LGBTIQ young people, they are still saying to us and to FEANTSA that they really require that additional support in order to accurately and equitably meet the needs of young people. So I think that's really telling. And then you can see on the next slide, there's uncertainty on whether or not they are at all. But again, we're seeing time and time again that they know that they could use that extra guidance, support, and education in terms of meeting their unique needs. And then the next one. And then, you see again, I don't think I need to read all this up to you, because I think we have a bunch more, but yeah, I think the next one is, these are like the challenges that people are identifying in terms of working with this specific population. There is a lack of confidence around the issue, which makes sense because if we're not seeing any sort of training or support around LGBTIQ homelessness, there's not that confidence to be able to meet their needs effectively. But there's also fears around young people's safety within their programming. And so I think that really speaks to the importance of staff training, the importance of creating inclusive, affirming spaces, because if you are creating these spaces that, as Gregory said, are meeting their needs and it's very clear from the uptake that a young person can be here and be safe, then that fear around safety would really be mitigated and brought down to a different level.
It's like fear is of the unknown. Fear is not having control, and the way to combat that is knowledge and understanding and training. So, yeah. So the next slide, this is specifically from ILGA-Europe's membership, so looking at LGBTIQ. And one thing I wanted to say, when I gave the US data, we don't have the I in America. It's something we're working to change. It's not something that is, the rest of the world is far ahead of America on that, and it's disappointing. So we're actually, as an organization, shifting and working to include intersex in our work, and so appreciate the work that's being done in Europe on that, because it's helping us be able to make the case for that to happen. But so this is the data coming from ILGA-Europe's membership. This does include Central Asia, because they work in Central Asia as well. So you can see a wide range. Almost every single country has at least one response in the overall survey. Next slide. So, and then also kind of the region served. So large metropolitan cities, not a surprise, and then the entire country, but also some representation from rural towns and villages and small and mid-sized cities and communities as well. So good representation from across demographics. Next. So this is really from policy support. So understanding country policy addressing youth homelessness, only 32% of the countries have a policy addressing. And then inclusive of LGBTQ youth, only 4% of that 32% is inclusive of LGBTQ. And then from government and financial supports, government supports programs targeting LGBTIQ youth homelessness, only 17%. And then funders that support LGBTI youth homelessness work, 24%. This will make sense even more so in a moment. And then organizational challenges, which is right here. So the first one is lack of research and data about LGBTI youth homelessness. And then the second one, lack of funding, not enough money, and then lack of political support and government support. So what was interesting, and you'll see in the comparative data, that there is a different set of priorities for the youth homelessness providers versus the LGBTI groups, but their data is the one thing that is the common thread across both groups. Next. So this is just one of the survey responses from somebody saying the most difficult challenge is a political climate and rising wave of homophobia and transphobia in connection to the political situation. We are concerned with further actions of the government that can make the situation of transgender people in Poland even worse. While solving problems already affecting the community could be only possible with governmental, legal, financial, and infrastructure support. So I'm going to turn this back over to Coco to kind of, we did a comparative analysis of the two different survey groups.
Yeah, that's great. So in terms of homelessness services versus LGBTI-focused organizations, we had 64 homelessness services respondents and 71 LGBTI-focused respondents, and they almost identically work at the same rate with LGBTI. In terms of that demographic data that we talked about a second ago, you can kind of see what you would maybe expect. So we have that the homeless services are really not collecting the data around sexual orientation and gender identity, and really focusing on sex and age, while LGBTI-focused organizations are collecting more broadly all of the data that's required there. In terms of like their estimates, you can see that the LGBTI-focused organizations have a much better idea of how many of their young people are experiencing housing instability and homelessness. That's really no surprise. But in general, both groups are pretty unsure about the numbers because it's just not being collected or spoken about. And also, I believe if it is being collected and it is being spoken about, it's not being shared. So, you know, they're going to drop-in center for LGBTI young people and then going to access general mainstream youth supports, and there the two shall meet, right? This is another quote that we had, which I think is pretty obvious. The field of LGBTI youth homelessness is really not clear, and we don't understand the full scope of it.
So the opportunities for change. So we identified 5 key areas that collectively we can all work on together. And the first one is developing prevention strategies. And that is really a universal need around the globe. Prevention just is not even on the cusp of people's consciousness because it's really about dealing with everybody's focus is on the immediate crisis of youth homelessness and making sure that young people who are experiencing it are getting the support. So we're not looking upstream. We're not even looking at how are young people entering into homelessness and then addressing those root causes. And until we do that, we're not going to end youth homelessness everywhere. Long story, big short, another quote. 50% among LGBTQ youth, they are driven away by ultra-religious families from disadvantaged and ultra-homophobic backgrounds. Others lost their jobs in the pre-pandemic period. So the systemic process of data collection, it's not a, it's weird to say a sexy thing to kind of like raise money on and kind of go out there and sell and get people's, you know, but data literally has been game-changing for us and for others. Like it's knowledge is power. Our co-founder Cindy Lauper always says knowledge is power, and that is sexy in the sense of getting people interested in and engaged in this issue. You can get in front of a politician, and when you have hard data in front of them, I've been in this situation time and time again where they just can't ignore you because you're giving them the hard facts. They may choose to, but they have to then use another justification about saying no, and that typically is just their straight up homophobia, biphobia, transphobia. Got to take all those other excuses out of the equation. Training and capacity building. So another thing across the board, LGBTIQ programs, a lot of them don't know how to deal with homelessness, whereas homelessness organizations don't have the skills to deal with LGBT. So you have these two, which leads to the next slide, leads to cross-sector collaboration. These two communities who are serving the same population, working with the same population, who have expertise that can help each other, learn from each other. So it's really about, the only way we're going to do this is homelessness services, LGBTI-focused programs, and government all working together in a collaborative way to address this problem. And then so we encourage you to check out the reports. They're all on our website, truecolorqra.org, to download. They're much deeper, much more nuanced, much more in-depth. And we're working to do these surveys around the globe so that in the next couple of years we'll be able to actually have a global perspective of what the needs are. And what I would say is that what's happened here in Europe is it's like rereading the data from 10 years ago in America. And obviously there's different political landscapes here, different cultural differences, so forth, that you can't compare and contrast exactly. But what I can say is that when we had the information, when we had the data that particularly came from the people working on the ground every single day, that was an absolute game changer. And what it looks like in America may not be what it looks like here, but with this information, and the more we can actually dig down and get it country by country, which is exciting that Lgbtiq has been doing this research and doing such an amazing job. Like, we can speak from experience that progress can happen with this sort of data information.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for this input. Like, a lot of things that you highlighted, again, quite resonate with us, especially in the focus of importance of the trainings and so on. Something that Jason was also telling us, and it's really visible from our research as well today in the morning. So we will open space for questions.
The one British person in the audience. So very happy to hear your presentation. Thank you very much indeed. It reminded me of work that I used to be involved in my working life, and the last time I participated in an ILGA event with the Young Persons Organisation as well, I was very struck by how difficult it was to connect the British experience with the European experience, and how it was useful to transfer knowledge and experiences to useful learning. My picture obviously is best of the United Kingdom, but my question is, what good practice, and what is the most helpful good practice have you come across in a European context that you might be able to share with us?
Sure.
Please.
Actually, Coco has been leading a lot of that work in Europe with Robbie and with our partners at ILGA-Europe. And what I would say, I'll just say one thing, is that 4 years ago, we just reached out and said, hey, we'd like to get to know ILGA-Europe and get to know FEANTSA and get to know your members. And we took the time and we built those relationships and we got to know each other and hear each other's stories and learn from each other. And so I would just say that's probably, a lot of people are afraid to take that first step of just being like, how can I build a relationship with you? How can I do that? And Coco's actually been doing a lot of work with both of those organizations to do exactly that.
So and you're asking about best practice, right? I think what we've found to be best practice as an organization and in working with other organizations, for me really boils down to authentic youth collaboration. So young people who have lived experience of homelessness, who are currently accessing services within mainstream homelessness services or LGBTIQ organizations need to be at the center of any program development, of any organizational change, of anything that is being prioritized or implemented. Because no one knows better what it's like to experience housing instability or homelessness than the young people that are experiencing it. And they know more than anyone what is necessary in order to feel safe, to feel affirmed, and to be able to show up authentically as their full holistic self. So I think we have youth collaboration and youth action as one of our program areas, but beyond that, it's really a theory that drives our organization, because young people have the keys to ending youth homelessness. We just really need to make sure that they're at the table, not just being tokenized to share their experiences with funders, but to really be asked and honored in their vision for how the system can be improved. So yeah, that's what I think about it, at least. Maybe someone else would say something.
And just to add to that, in the sense of like, how does that look? How does that actually like show up? So we help create, like the role we play as adults is we help work with young people to create youth action boards. And the reason we use the word action as opposed to advisory is because so many times when we work with young people, they're tokenized and they're looked at, we just want your opinion, we just want to hear what you have to say. In reality, it's about helping to create the opportunities for them to step into their own power and for them to be driving the kind of change themselves, either as partners or in their own right, to advance this work. And that's one of the ways that the work in America has fundamentally changed. For one example of that is I shared about this $450 million a year program that got started about 5 years ago that our federal government started. Young people are at the heart. They actually were key players in developing what that program looks like. And then they actually review all the applications from local communities, and their scores are graded the highest. They're one trained on how to do the review, but then their scores are the highest ranked. And these are primarily Black and brown LGBTIQ young people doing this. And so they're actually stepped in and they actually have the power to make these kinds of decisions. And that's one fundamental way. I know that's not going to be easy for many places for that to happen. But 10 years ago, young people's voices weren't even heard in any way, shape, or form in America.
Thank you so much for this. Are there any other questions from the audience?
Hello, my name is Ira. I work for a short period of time only with public home fund of the city of Ljubljana. Can you give, do you have an idea how much damage has the Trump service done in this year to the field of homelessness, of LGBT, or because we are facing our now national leader, so he states we are in bigger problems than we have already now. And even our friends from Parada, Ponosa, they mentioned that only the mayor is the one who is supporting them, and that can be a problem, yes?
Yeah.
Please.
So there are two things. So the Trump administration from day one set out to harm the LGBTQ community. Like that was on their agenda. They set out strongly on that front. And we fortunately have been able to, in the short time Biden's been in, and through a whole bunch of legal channels we personally sued our federal government in America, and we also executed a very large-scale public campaign to push back on a specific form of discrimination we were trying to do around trans people in shelters, in federally funded shelters. And we were able to defeat all of that by using our government and basically throwing molasses into their wheels and kept them from being able to implement a lot of things before they were kicked out of office. And then we're still undoing a lot of the damage that was done. A lot of really good people in the federal government left because they couldn't stick it out for 4 years. So unfortunately, a lot of those people are going back in. And so what I would say in a very short period of time, we've moved from defense to a very offensive kind of working with the federal government. We're now having conversations with our federal government about how are we training all of their grantees around serving trans people, whereas we were trying to keep them from implementing really horrible policies. So it was very damaging specifically to trans and LGBTQI people in America, but we're now shifting. The homelessness side, they didn't really pay attention to it for the first 3 years of their administration. And then Trump saw homelessness as a political issue because he saw that as a wedge issue, as a way to divide, as a way to mobilize his base. Because saying all these homeless people are going to bring crime and drugs and all the kind of bull. Sorry, I was going to curse there. So they were mobilizing that and actually brought in this really horrible guy to run the homelessness program in the federal government. And we, for the first time, our homelessness movement, which had never been political, had to come together, in which we had always been political because we come from an LGBTQ frame, and very much, but the homelessness movement, as a byproduct of that, is now more cohesive and more united around ending youth homelessness and looking at it from a political perspective and centering LGBTQ and BIPOC, which are bi, indigenous, people of color, in the kind of response to how we're moving together. So with the bad has come a lot of good, and we obviously have to make sure that in 3 years, we don't get another Trump or somebody, or Trump themselves. Yeah. Does that answer your question? Okay.
There was also another question, if I saw it correctly, right?
You also answered mine.
Okay, so we still have time for a question or two. So if there is any, please talk now.
I'll just ask, the last thing about what you were saying. Like, I gave you the American construct of that. You're seeing what happened in America happening all around the world. You're seeing it, and just yesterday in Hungary, they passed a really horrible anti-LGBTQ bill, banning, educating about LGBTQ people and so forth. The parallels, I've talked to our partners that we have down in Brazil and what Sierra is doing down there and the horrible aspect of the horrible things. Way I'm able to keep doing this work in light of that, and in light of 4 years that took such a horrible toll in America and thus around the globe, is channeling that into further action and unity and coming together behind a united front. So every place is going to be different, and obviously the U.S. system of government is very different than anywhere else on the planet. But at the heart of it is, it can be so defeating, it can be so harmful and hurtful and traumatic to live through that. But we've seen what happens when you come together and you unite against something like that. And there's a little bit of hope out of that, is that you can see what happened in America, and probably such a diverse body of people came together to vote him out. That it's really about that. It's really about keeping people together and unifying and linking arms with people that understand what it's like to be oppressed and be pushed down. Because everybody, for the most part, has been pushed down and discriminated at some point in their lives. And so let's have empathy for each other. Let's unite with each other. And I think the possibilities are endless about what we can achieve as a society.
Perfect.
Sorry, that wasn't asked, but
No, I'm super glad you. Okay, another question.
Very interesting presentation. I found it really interesting that you mentioned homeless movement, because I don't necessarily automatically think about it in this activism form. So I was thinking, do you see it also? Because now it happened as a response to this increased oppression, right? But do you also see a role of this kind of homeless activism, in prevention of homelessness, as in, I don't know, raising awareness or in some sort of way?
Yeah, I mean, my main thought is, I think that's really interesting, and a lot of people that we consider colleagues or partners, we all call it the movement to end youth homelessness. It's always considered a movement, that's the language that we always use, and there's a ton of activism around it. I think also what's really politicized people beyond having that person as a president for so long, but it was also, the coronavirus and what it really forced people to reconcile, which was that your government is not going to save you, that when, we have all these people that are out of work, that have no money, aren't able to pay rent, homelessness is right there, right? And so experiencing housing instability is right there for everyone, and it's something that is not selective. And so I think that kind of radicalized a lot of people and made them see, that experience in a different light. In terms of prevention, I think the closest that I would say we've gotten to having kind of the same snappy connection to the movement and youth homelessness is kind of born out of that, because it really looks like, well, how do we prevent then all these people who are now out of work and unable to make their rent from experiencing housing instability and homelessness? And I think for the first time that became a really mainstream conversation, because we really focus on how to end homelessness that already exists, and people have kind of a fatalistic approach where they're like, well, it's inevitable. People are going to become homeless and that's it. So we have some cities and states across the United States that are taking what we consider a housing first approach. So if somebody is, right, everybody's familiar with that? Yeah, so, what a radical idea. If someone is going to experience housing instability or homelessness, you give them a home, and then everything else. You can't expect someone to have a full-time job, enter into sobriety, go to school, whatever it is, if they don't have somewhere to sleep, So I think that's becoming a much more mainstream conversation as well, and hopefully will take off more broadly.
One thing I'd just add to that is that you have two communities, right? You have two movements. You have the LGBTIQ movement and then the youth homelessness movement, right? There's a very distinct difference between the two. In the LGBTIQ community, you have a body of people who are personally being oppressed and being discriminated against and are fighting for their own liberation, right? It's driven by members of the community. Whereas in the youth homelessness space, it's a very paternalistic system, right? It's a very we're here to save you, we're here to help you, and it's looked at, and it's also a very generational thing where I've worked with people who I love and respect who've been doing this work for 40 years, and it came from it was like, oh, we're going to come in and save these young people. Coming from a good place, but they don't view it as a movement because their personal lives are not being impacted or being affected by homelessness. Whereas that's why what Coco was talking about and what we've been working really hard about is that it has to be people who are experiencing homelessness that are at the heart of the movement. And that makes it a movement because it's their lives that have been impacted, it's their peers that are being impacted, and they have to be at the center of the movement. And we do have to be thinking about it as a movement. And the LGBTIQ community needs to look at homelessness as part of the community's work, if LGBTIQ people don't have the basic needs of housing, food, healthcare, education, employment, then what are we doing as a movement? Not that we shouldn't be fighting for things like marriage equality and so forth. Of course, those are important, but the basic needs of our community are continually being put at the bottom. When if we made those things happen for our community, all the other stuff would come to the table. Eventually. And so we have to kind of shift our priorities. And so we have to do that in the LGBTIQ community, and we have to get the youth homelessness space and the homelessness space to look at this as more of a movement and not a service delivery system.
Yeah.
Gregory, Coco, thank you so much once again. This was actually quite a nice trailer for this afternoon as well. Right? Yeah. So
Coco's amazing. You don't want to miss it.
So from 3:30 to 5, Coco will be also leading a workshop here in this space. So please stay, get a bit more hands-on, right? Perspective on these issues. Right? Yeah, so thank you so much for your perspective. Thank you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Okay, pozdrav sem. Zelo sem srečen, kar sem danes z vami in kar lahko predstavim naš projekt to housing, but that will happen in English. Sorry for that, but my Slovenian is finished. I need vocals. And thank you for inviting me. It is lovely to be there, to be here also at distance, but I hope we can meet again soon in presence. And I really would like to go back to lovely Ljubljana. The title of my intervention, hello everyone, everyone is wearing masks. The title of my intervention could be how we became service provider without having one single data to rely on. Not even a researcher or one single data. So that's because in Italy, the topic is totally understudied, if not invisible. And so I'm very, very grateful to all international organizations who are working to collect data, to do research and surveys and interviews, and that's quite important for us that are working on the field. Yeah, that allows me a little bit, just a little note about the context. As we are neighbors, I'm sure you're familiar with our culture, which is a very patriarchal society and machist society and culture. And yeah, unfortunately, I don't know if you have seen the last Rainbow Index published by ILGA-Europe, according to which Italy scores a total of 22%, which is, I don't know if you know the Rainbow Index. It's an index that analyzes country by country the situation concerning legal protection and anti-discrimination laws. And we are scoring a tragic number that is 22. And truth to be told, we are still waiting for an anti-discrimination law, which is stuck in the parliament since, I guess, 2 years. And actually, we've been waiting for this law for 30 years. So I needed to give you these notes about the context, because it's quite important considering also the work we are doing. Just a bit clarification about our project, which is called To Housing, because it's a co-housing project based in Torino. So it's a little tribute to our city. A little clarification, because we are open not only to LGBTIQ youth, but to anyone of every age. And secondly, we're not working only with the homelessness. We are trying to tackle every vulnerability of the LGBTQ community members. That means people at risk of exclusion, poverty, and marginalization. So in that sense, we would like to be a sort of a prevention center besides helping on homeless. I guess we can move to the video. If you can launch it, please, and then I can give some more details about the things that we're saying in the video.
Perfect. So we have it ready here.
Quore, like many associations, has received requests for assistance by many LGBTQI people over the years. This includes people in discomfort and in marginal positions, with common experiences of discrimination based on sexual orientation or gender identity. Institutions provide some solutions for housing emergencies, poverty or social exclusion, but how many existing services are able to respond to such specific needs? What type of expertise is put in place to face the complexity of welcoming LGBTQI people? These questions have prompted Quore to plan a social co-housing and hospitality model, not only to satisfy the need of having a home, but also, and above all, to accompany the guests through a journey of independence and empowerment. Very young people, transgender and transitioning people, men and women with several vulnerabilities, lonely people, Quore welcomes and embraces them into the To Housing project. We've put a lot of energy into researching public and private partners that would invest in the project and its values. The search for the right place started by visiting the many houses available in our city and discussing with the institutions that manage them. The turning point arrived with the support of ATC Piemonte, the Territorial Housing Assistance Agency, which joined the project and made 5 big apartments available at controlled prices, with a total of 24 beds. This allowed us to participate in tenders and obtain important resources from the Piedmont region and from Iren. The apartments needed to be renovated. The generous contribution of 2 private organizations, Bentley SOA and Cooperativa di Vittorio, made this work possible, making the houses ready to be furnished. The final touch involved the decisive support of IKEA, which has strongly believed in the project. as well as furnished and provided all the lighting for all the bedrooms, kitchens, bathrooms and living rooms for the Torhousing apartments. To complete the setup and make the project sustainable in time, Quore's staff dedicated itself to fundraising activities. The association has looked for public financing, foundation tenders and contributions or services sponsored by companies. Fundraising campaigns are also continuously being studied. Luckily today, the list of people donating time, money, electric appliances, dishes and clothes is growing increasingly longer. To Quore, Torhousing doesn't just mean providing the guests with a bed and a roof. Above all, the project wants to offer them the tools to imagine and design a new way of life. These activities are Torhousing's core values and are taken care of by the multidisciplinary team of professionals and volunteers. The operators provide personal assistance, from accompanying the guests to the territorial services, to helping them with the practical, bureaucratic and healthcare aspects throughout their stay. Quore's staff psychologists and psychotherapists guarantee counseling services to the guests with individual appointments. Experts in the sector carry out education and work orientation activities, from the acquisition of skills and the editing of a CV to active job research or an educational program. The Torhousing apartments are located in a building complex in a multi-ethnic environment that has its difficulties. In order to integrate the project and its guests into the residents' reality, Quore has activated a social animation program to create exchange and occasions for dialogue and to contrast homotransphobia and racism. Sports activities, theatre laboratories, cooking laboratories, convivial lunches and informal meetings are organised along with adults and children from the region. Also in this case, the specific expertise and collaborations of Quore's numerous partners are essential. Another of the project's greatest values is the concept of giving back. In other words, the possibility that Torhousing guests will in turn help the inhabitants of the building complex, favouring a mechanism of mutuality and reciprocity. This is the story of Torhousing's beginning, a journey that started with the will to satisfy specific needs. A journey that led Quore to fulfill an innovative project through the help of professionals and volunteers. A long path in which the support network has been essential. The results obtained are the demonstration that this network has to be widened as much as possible to make the project sustainable, developable and replicable.
Thank you. I hope you enjoyed it. I think the video gives an idea of the overall work that we are doing, but I can go in more specifically into details to explain what we're doing and the methodology and so on and so forth. As you can see, the whole service is strongly based on a support system, because besides providing our guests with a roof and a bed and food, basically it's all about empowering LGBTIQ people and supported them through the search of a new life perspective. Another of beneficiaries or many other services, call them clients, I guess, at European level. We usually call them guests. So share the screen. Okay, can you see the slide presentation? So this is our project logo. This is very important that the supporters, maybe I can tell you something about our fundraising strategy later. The project is managed by Associazione Quore, which is my association. I'm the vice president of the association and co-founded in 2007. We are a non-profit organization advocating for LGBTIQ rights in Italy. We have been developing our activities lately. That goes from awareness campaigns, organizing, training programs, cultural projects, and so on. And we have something like 40 members now. And in the project, there are about 20 persons involved, both as professional and members of the organization. Yeah, as I was mentioning, the co-housing is not only a co-housing project, but it's a support project. And as we can see later, we are providing psychological support, career guidance, medical or legal support, health support, and we're doing that thanks to this wide network of allies and partners we were able to build in the years, in 2 years and a half. We started thanks to a collaboration with the local public housing agencies, as you have seen in the video, that gave us 5 apartments to start with. We are paying the rents, even if it's at controlled price. The 5 apartments can host up to 24 guests globally, and the residence is temporary. People usually stay up to 8-10 months, but it depends from, of course, the situation. But we are, of course, very flexible because every person has his own time of regaining independence and autonomy. As you can see, all our apartments are totally furnished by IKEA, which sponsored our project at the beginning. They really believed in the project. They gave us the furnishing, and they also actually hired a couple of our guests as employees, and that is quite important because established a virtuous collaboration, and it shows that they really believe in the project we are doing. Every apartment is dedicated to an LGBTIQ activist who is no longer with us, and yeah, we felt it was important to pay this tribute, and it's also important for our guests in terms of empowering, in terms of knowing our history and where we come from, as far as the fight is concerned, the fight against transport is concerned. And these were amazing people living in the area. So here you have we have the main feature of the project. Talking about targets, as I was mentioning, we are welcoming people of every age, but these are the most frequent flyers, I would say. So of course, LGBTIQ youth, as you know, who were somehow abandoned or rejected by the family of origin. If you want, I can show you later on some data concerning the profile of our guests we have had so far. Then we have a big percentage of refugees, migrants, and asylum seekers. As you know, Italy has been in recent years the point of arrival of many migrants and refugees. And of course, we felt, we knew that there was the need to support their integration process, because homosexuality is a reason for them to get international protection status. So we have specific programs for asylum seekers. And but maybe I will show you later the collaboration we have. Of course, trans and transgender people who particularly suffer the stigma, at least in this country. And LGBTIQ elderly people, but I must say that we haven't had many requests from elderly, basically because we are temporary residents, and of course they tend to find more stable solution. So this is the service model I was anticipating before. We offer temporary solution in terms of housing emergency. And we are providing basic daily support for any daily needs they might have. We are providing training, work, counseling, and this is a very important activity, I would say crucial to support them in their active search for a job or for training opportunities. And then of course, psychological support and counseling is also very important because many of them need to elaborate the trauma they come from. And we are talking about experiences of abandonment, exclusion, intolerance, if not violence, violence and abuse. So this is a very delicate and important aspect. And then we are starting to work towards the community that the project is in. We are organizing some community building activities. We felt it was important to not only to integrate our guests in the context, but also to extend our support activities to especially to young people in the area, in the neighborhood. We have, as far as protocols of Austin agreements, we have 4 different protocols. As you can see, we have the emergency protocols that is basically for a couple of weeks for people who already might have some other solution and just need a quick rest. Then we have the project itself, the support project that is for 10 months, as I was saying, very flexible. And then, as I was mentioning, we have 2 agreements with the national government for refugees and asylum seekers, because one of our apartment is considered, we call it CAS, with the Center of Extraordinary Welcoming for Migrants. And we are doing this thanks with an agreement with the prefecture in Turin. And we have another agreement with the Refugees City Office of Torino that is dedicated again for asylum seekers. We're doing all that. All those support activities are conducted by a multidisciplinary team. We call it Equipe, that manages the whole process. The staff is composed by one educator. He is also the coordinator of the staff working with the guests. Unfortunately, he doesn't speak English, otherwise he will be the one talking to you. He's a great professional, and yeah, it's our best staff member. And then we have 3 psychologists, 2 social workers, 1 job expert who provides the activity as a job and career guidance, and 1 psychiatrist. Actually, we didn't have that psychiatrist at the very beginning, but we immediately understand that was needed, unfortunately. Well,
Silvia,
yeah.
sorry, I will stop you here a bit because I wanted to invite you to maybe share a few final thoughts with us, because we are running out of time super fast. So maybe just some closing words and something you really want to share with us here.
Talking about, shall I stop the screen sharing?
Sure. It's always lovely to look at you.
Thanks. I can tell you about briefly the two areas of intervention we are going towards to. We are opening our services also to people who are not in the house, in the apartments. That means that we are kind of becoming a sort of an anti-discrimination center. So we will manage to provide our services also to extend our services also to outsiders, let's say. And the second aspect, second areas of intervention we are working on is the community. As I was, we started, you've seen in the video, and I was mentioning it earlier in the slide presentation, we are increasing the activities towards the family in the neighborhood who are also in a condition of poverty or vulnerability, especially after the pandemic crisis. So it is important to integrate our experience with the neighborhood and the context in general.
Perfect, Silvia, that was brief.
Am I good? Short enough?
Yes, perfect. So now we are still going to open the floor for the audience. I just wanted to say that it's really, really, like I've already seen this presentation, right? But it's really impressive, the work you're doing. And I think we're especially happy that you managed to share this, as we're also quite inspired with your practice while creating our own crisis network, something that Vesna is going to talk a bit during the conference today, a bit later. So it's really lovely to get this input as well.
How did you manage to build such a team of professionals? What would your advice be to us here who are struggling maybe to be able to do that?
Okay, so Nea was actually wondering about the equipe that you were talking about, having it, being it as a team of diverse professionals, like having this quite holistic approach, and whether you would have some advice or maybe just to tell a bit about your beginnings in the terms of like equipping these people together, like how did you recognize the needs for these professions and so on? Sorry, I interpreted a bit more your question.
Yeah, most of the professionals that are involved in the process were members of our association. So they are both professional and activists. And that was quite a key point because we weren't starting from the ground from zero, because they were already trained in terms of communicating with LGBTIQ people. And we basically are all LGBTIQ people. And the most difficult part, I would say, is to find the finances and the funding to be able to reward correctly all the professionals. And truth to be told, some of them started as volunteers, but now we are able to pay them as fairly. And I guess I heard something like advice. We were stubborn as hell, especially towards our supporters, bank foundations, private and public bodies, and to ask for support.
I think your stubbornness statement has, opened the floor for questions. So there's one coming.
Yeah, so my question is, what is your yearly budget for the program? You mentioned you actually pay rent. I guess you take care of utility costs, you take care of the, all the different elements of the program. So what is your yearly budget for the program?
200,000 euros yearly. If you would talk about the distribution of our budget, I could say that the 70% of our budget is comes from private organizations, both bank foundations and private companies, and the rest 30% comes from the local government. We haven't got any governmental funding so far, but they just launched a call for proposal, and we hope we will be able to get some governmental fund also by the end of the year. We have translated at least our website, so in any case you can search through information in our website, that is quore.org.
There is one question. Okay.
Yes, hello, thank you for the presentation. I was wondering, you mentioned fundraising a little bit, and I was wondering what is your most successful tactic in a sense of how to ask, you know, what to ask for, what are you fundraising for, you know, more in this conceptual way, how do you fundraise?
I'm sorry, I couldn't hear the second part. We're talking about fundraising strategy.
Exactly, about fundraising strategy, but also from this perspective of, like, what do you actually tell to the people? Like, what is the concept that you're selling?
We're talking about exclusion and vulnerability. We're talking about episodes of homotransphobia, which we have a backlash in terms of episodes in Italy in recent time. We talk about inclusion broadly. In fact, we were able to get some funding from the general social services. They were not even knowing that we were working with LGBTIQ people. We are working on poverty and inclusion and vulnerabilities. But then, of course, we also have many allies, thanks to which we were able to get to private companies.
Okay. Well, Silvia, thank you so much. I think we will finish here then now. Once again, thank you for joining us.
Hvala vam.